So I am joined by Jed and Shari as we continue our series on meditations on Matero. This time we are going to be dealing with chapter 2 on the High Priestess, and I always want to give my conversation partners the chance to go ahead and say something first, rather than me just dominate the conversation right off the bat. So is there anything that either of you would like to point toward immediately about this chapter?
Yeah, Tomberg nails consciousness, man. In
I
this
heard,
guy.
I saw you drop that comment in the Voxer yesterday. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think so in the high priestess imagery of kind of in the imagery that he outlines, like, the reflective nature of consciousness, that you need kind of fire and water. So he's using the imagery from John chapter 3, that you have to be born of water and of spirit, and that spirit on its own cannot be reflective, so you require that reflective presence of the water, of a kind of this reflective, like the impression coming from the spirit reflects into kind of like a sense perception, right? But then that can then filter into like a practical application of the book. But the the nature of it is like there's never just one thing within consciousness, and he gets that in his discussion of duality in the chapter. Is that consciousness is also kind of it's a dialectical process,
Hmm.
and I just found it to be, honestly, I think that he's probably a lot closer, just in terms of what, if we ever come to like a real scientific theory of consciousness, I would venture to guess that he's probably closer than, even though he's doing kind of more of the metaphysics of consciousness, I think that he's getting a sense of how consciousness actually works, right?
Well,
Right.
what's kind of interesting about that, it's not really his idea, right? Like, this is ancient.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's from the symbology of the card.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, this understanding of consciousness was far superior to what we, I think, what we understand today. Was, yeah. Like, I when I was reading it, I was thinking, this is this is the process of articulation,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And it resonated with me because I spent so much time by myself with my thoughts. I hadn't ever gotten to that writing the book part,
Mm.
and when I got involved with Paul Vanderklay's community, and then, for the first time wrote a YouTube comment, felt like I was entering into another spatial dimension.
Sherry, just for our listeners, I know what you mean because I've read the book. For when you talk about the writing the book part, could you explain what you mean for the sake of our audience?
Well, yeah, the card is the high priestess sitting and looking into a book, right? So he's talking about, I don't know if I can explain it well, but he's talking about the how reflection produces an inner representation, and then memory is a like a source of communication through speech.
I think I actually, let me see here.
And then speech
I think I have
is
a quote
fixed by
here.
writing the book. So to me, it's articulation. When you write the book, then you start to speak all the reflected contemplative thoughts that you've been having, right?
Right.
That's how I
He talks about this quite a bit in the chapter, but here's a short section that kind of explains a little bit what he's talking about. Because he's talking about, like, the writing of the book is like the last stage, right? And it's actually connected to Hermetic philosophy, is the writing of the book part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Whereas the process, it begins with, so it's mysticism, gnosis, magic, and Hermetic philosophy. So he says here, spiritual touch or intuition is that which permits contact between our consciousness and the world of pure mystical experience. It is by virtue of this that there exists in the world and in the history of mankind a real relationship between the living soul and the living God, which is true religion. Mysticism is the source and root of all religion. Without it, Religion and the entire spiritual life of humanity would only be a code of laws regulating human thought and action. If God signifies for man something more than an abstract notion, it is thanks to the spiritual touch or mysticism. This is the seed of religious life, with its theology, rituals, and practicism. Mysticism is also the seed of Gnosis, which is esoteric theology. Just as magic is esoteric art and occultism or Hermeticism is esoteric philosophy. Now, mysticism is the yod of the Tetragrammaton, just as Gnosis is the first he. The magi is the vow or the child of mysticism and Gnosis, and Hermetic philosophy is the second and final he, i.e., the summation of what is revealed. The last he, or Hermetic philosophy, is the book, which the high priestess holds on her knees, whilst the three layers of her tiara represent the stages of descent of revelation from the mystical plane to the Gnostic plane, and then from the Gnostic plane to the magical plane, and then lastly, from the magical plane to the philosophical plane, to the plane of the book or the doctrine.
Right.
So that's
I
what
mean,
you're,
the book is the final,
right.
yeah. But I mean, a simpler one because it's right in the beginning, he kind of lays it out without the use of those gnosis and magic and reflection. He says, it is a reflection which renders it perceptible, comparable, and understandable. So this is like what Jed's talking about, like this process of consciousness, right? So you have this reflection, which makes something perceptible, and it produces an inner representation, which becomes retained by the memory. Memory becomes the source of communication by means of the spoken word, and the communicated word becomes fixed by means of writing, by producing the book. So that's why I thought of it as articulation, right? So you have this process of contemplation, which is why mysticism has to be at the base of everything, because you can't write down something that you haven't thought about, like.
Well, you haven't experienced.
Yeah.
Mysticism is where the experience happens. Like if you begin, like this is he talks about later about the problem of
the representations, right?
The problem of gnosis. So gnosis divorced from mysticism would be like intellectual speculative theology.
That he says that actually,
right,
in the book. Like, where do I have that? I wrote it down because I thought it was good. Anyway, he says that you can have gnosis without mysticism, but then it's just an intellectual exercise, like you said. Yeah.
Right.
It's kind of
because you have no experience of the thing which you were talking about.
Yeah.
Right. And what is that experience like in mysticism? I don't want people to think that it's like, oh, you're out there just floating around, levitating, and that's not that's not the mystical experience. The mystical
he does. He says what it is.
Well, in my terms, it's interacting with the representations, which is the world, right? It's being in your body, and it's sensing the world around you and taking it in through all of your senses, and that initiates the contemplative process, because that's how we attend. We attend through our senses, right? So when and it's like he says in the magician chapter, it's the art of learning, and the art of learning begins with attention.
He says it's the spiritual sense of touch, right? Or he says it's spiritual touch,
right?
And it's related to intuition. And Emil Bach, when we read Apocalypse of John by Emil Bach, he has the same exact idea.
Yeah.
And this is like this. We can see this in our speech. This is the way we talk about it, because we say usually when we're talking about an awareness of a spiritual presence, we say things like, I felt the presence of God, or I could feel the presence of the Holy Spirit in the room. So we know that it's connected, this connection to touch. It's right. You can see it in our language and the way we try to articulate it, even though the actual experience is inarticulable.
Right.
The way we try to articulate it is in terms of those analogies of touch.
Yeah. Well, what's really, really fascinating too is that his use of gnosis, like so like in that kind of like the meditation practice that I use, where I'll meditate through these seven heavens, right? There's a distinction between what would be the fifth heaven, so third from the bottom, which is the heaven of knowledge, and in the And this comes out of Isaiah chapter 11. So in the Septuagint translation, that is translated as gnosis, right? But then you have your, what would correspond to the second heaven, or the third eye, is the heaven of understanding. So there's these two different centers of what we would deem knowledge, right? And he develops it a little bit differently, but it still, I think, applies somewhat, is that like that gnosis is kind of more of the gut intuitive knowledge, right? And the understanding, or that third eye kind of correspondence, is more of like the rational apperception, right? Where you are forming in concepts and abstract concepts from the experience of what you have kind of got at that gut level, that sensory kind of impression, right? And so the kind of within that kind of mysticism, I think that there's kind of, you're operating with both aspects of knowledge, right? And it's really important to have that in place. If you just jump to like, and I think we tend to, like in the West, we tend to just jump straight to the rationalism, right? Which is part of it, but you're missing the other half of knowledge, which is it's experiential, and it is inarticulate, right?
And it's humbling.
Yeah.
It's humbling. There's, I was thinking about this because I mentioned before we started recording that I just reread Solovyov's Tale of the Antichrist while I was sitting in a very long eye doctor's appointment.
Mhm.
And it occurred to me as I was reading this chapter that like the one thing, so Solovyev calls his Antichrist the coming man. And the one thing that the coming man is missing is actually the mystical element. He
Uh-huh.
has gnosis, he has magic, and he has philosophy. And he has them at the highest level, but it's the experience, the mysticism that he's missing, which is why he doesn't have humility, because he thinks it's all entirely product of himself. He has no idea that there's any divine cooperation, and this is what creates his like essential selfishness, which is why he goes wrong. Because he has good, he's a moral person.
Mhm. Yeah.
He cares about people. He wants good outcomes. It's very interesting because the way he portrays the Antichrist is not
No, the
the way
Antichrist will
we typically
be the best
think.
of us. The Antichrist will be the best of us,
Right.
but that will be the worst of us.
Right.
Well, I
Right.
want to talk about this a little bit, because I think there's one element missing in what you're talking about, and it's images. I'm going to go down the images road, and I found that thing that I wrote. So if there's no mirror, there's no images. So the mirror is what happens in mysticism, right? Like in mysticism, you're approaching the mirror, and what is that? What is the mirror? I think it's creation, right?
That was kind of similar impression that I have, is it's the receptivity to the activity of spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it is really the created realm is
It is, yeah.
that kind of hall of mirrors that are reflecting the activity of.
So you have to reflect on the mirror, right, which is Sophia, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the hiddenness of God in the world. And the world is made up of images, right? So then he says that gnosis is intellectual thought with no images.
Right.
Okay, so that is really interesting to me.
Right.
Because
this is why poetry is such a big deal.
Well, it's also
I'll keep pounding the table for that.
Iconoclasm is such a big deal.
Right.
I'm serious. Like
I'm with you, Shari.
Yeah, like iconoclasm is a huge deal. It's when we've arrived at a space where you have an intellect with no images, right? And you have a gnosis with no mysticism, essentially, is what I'm understanding through this text, right? And then he's got a quote here from Plotinus. It's a little bit of a tongue twister, but I'll read it. When the mirror is there, the mirror image is produced. But when it is not there, or is not in the right state, the object of which the image would have been is, in brackets, all the same, actually there. And you have to think about that. I mean, so what he's saying is, even if it's not there, the object is still there, right? The creation is still there. In the same way as regards the soul, when that kind of thing in us, which mirrors the images of thought and intellect, is undisturbed, we see them and know them in a way parallel to sense perception, which is touch, right? Along with the prior knowledge that it is intellect and thought that are active. But when this is broken, because the harmony of the body is upset, thought and intellect operate without an image, and then intellectual activity takes place without a mind picture.
Right. And that undisturbed like ties back to what.
Real quick, I don't want to interrupt too much, but after you're done, I think it'd be helpful just for the audience if we kind of discuss the imagery of the card itself.
Oh,
yeah,
sure.
That would be good.
Sure.
So anyway, continue. I just didn't want us to.
Yeah, no, that's a very great point. Yeah, we should definitely do that. And I think there's a section where he like talks about that, so we can go over that. But what you just said about the stillness ties back to what Jed was talking about with water and fire, which ultimately ties back to what Christ was trying to tell Nicodemus, because it's still water, which becomes the mirror, right? Because like in nature, that's like the natural reflective, that's the mirror of nature is still water.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in that passage when Jesus interacts with Nicodemus, he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you," right? "Unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom." And he makes a point that he says "truly, truly" twice. The first "truly" is inbreathed breath, a truth. Sorry, inbreathed truth, and the second "truly" is reflected truth, which is the breath, right? Like it's the
inhale and inhalation and exhalation. Yeah, I had the same thought when I was reading that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the imagery.
Let me hold up that I'm going to do old school because I'm an old school girl.
Right.
So.
I can also find an image of
There's the image,
card.
everybody, of the card.
Yeah, and I actually have from my writer deck as well. I actually kind of like the writer deck a little bit better. And you'll see.
You have an image?
I do.
Okay.
So the writer deck actually pulls in temple imagery as well. So you have the
interesting.
and Yakim pillars with the curtain of basically the Holy of Holies behind it. Right. Her crown is a little bit different, has that reflective kind of the mirror on the top with her foot on the moon. And she's holding the book that says, either tarot or Torah, depending on how you want to read it. But the Torah imagery is very important in the writer.
What are those yellow things?
Which ones here? Are we talking about? We have this the crescent moon.
Yellow balls.
And then these are kind of pomegranates set in the curtain of the Holy of Holies.
Oh, okay.
And so I'm not sure exactly what the yellow, but it's basically paradise type imagery, kind of in a sense. In this deck, I take as like a temple imagery. So like consciousness itself stands within the veil, so to speak.
Right, and he's talking about specifically about the way to restore the Eden consciousness. So that garden imagery makes total sense.
It's interesting because Isis has that same head. Isis, the goddess Isis, she has the same head thing.
Yeah, and she wears in the High Priestess. What's interesting is she wears. It's hard to catch. I'll have to pull it in a little closer, but she has the cross above her heart, right? And so there's like you kind of have this confluence of Jewish, pagan, and Christian imagery all within the card, right? And so there's this kind of this bringing together, and I think that's kind of within even the Hermetic school is kind of relying on that cross-pollination of thought and truth wherever it's found, right? So some of like the cult of Isis stuff does surface in tarot imagery, not specifically on the card that he's using, but the writer deck is kind of the old standard deck right now. So it's very interesting.
I think it's a very.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's a very old symbol,
mm-hmm.
Because the woman clothed with the sun symbol that you showed, Nate, that coin,
Yeah.
almost the same shape.
Well, that's the moon. The moon at the feet, like that definitely echoes the woman clothed in the sun.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
she has the also like the water imagery is really reflected in her gown or her robe, which is it kind of cascades down here if you can see. It's just for those that are kind of watching and tuning in, at least to give you a mental reference of like some of the concepts we're talking about. It's really anchored in the imagery of the card itself, and so the water imagery, like what's interesting in the Rider Waite deck is that the water imagery it's what she's clothed in. So herself is the reflective instrument.
yeah.
Although the one thing we do lose in the Rider-Waite image that's in the medieval tarot image, which I'm still trying to find other than the copy in the book, is the top is the chair slash wings,
Mm-hmm.
which he does talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that having the crescent moon, which echoes the woman clothed in the sun, kind of still brings that, because that still places that's still, and actually maybe even more so, because both are suggested, even though she's seated, the potency of heavenly flight is still suggested in the imagery
Yeah,
on the Rider-Waite deck too.
like it's kind of hard to escape like the connection between the high priestess and Mary.
Right.
Like in a sense, Mary is the archetypal high priestess. You know,
Right.
you even go into some of the old, I forget which, it might have been like, I don't know, one of the like Gospel of James or like one of the early Christian texts that's outside of the canon, had Mary and Joseph as workers helping with the construction of the temple, right? During some of Herod's renovations and then just upkeep. And Mary's job was actually she was like a weaver
Right.
within the temple, and Joseph was a carpenter. And so like Mary is very associated with like the temple itself, even early within the Christian tradition. She's understood in that respect. And the temple
Right.
imagery
And the temple imagery just reinforces that.
Well, there's
yeah.
even
And
tradition
also
that she was
I
raised in the
think
temple,
there's
Jed.
and
That she
and
was-
I'm sorry. I couldn't
Oh,
quite hear
sorry.
you, Sherry.
There's even tradition that she was even raised in the temple.
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
Well, that's why, right. That's why she's ever virgin, is because she's dedicated
Yeah.
to the temple. And that which also like the whole like that also that adds so many layers of meaning to a whole lot of the gospel narrative too.
Oh
Like
yeah.
especially when you're reading in um I hate using the term Old Testament, but when you're reading in the Hebrew scriptures about like
Hebrew
how
scripture.
serious you are to take vows to God that are not required by the law, right? But are
Mhm.
that are undertaken optionally, but they're taken very seriously. Um, we were just in our Bible study at my church. We were just reading Leviticus 27, which was dealing with that
Nazarite.
the whole seriousness of these
Mhm.
vows
Mhm.
that are optional vows are taken before God. And actually, if people don't keep these vows, they're punishable by death.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
um,
Do you
Yeah.
mean
It's
vows of celibacy or?
well
but
the,
just
the
any kind
Leviticus.
of vow made before God is like
Oh, okay. Yeah.
you don't have to. It basically saying you don't have. Essentially, you don't have to do these things, but if you do these things, it's a vow before God.
Right.
You have to keep it.
That's
I'm
interesting
sure. I'm
because
sure. I'm sure Joseph will probably correct my interpretation later, but
But that's covering the Leviticus 27 covers the Nazarite vow, correct?
I don't think it mentions that one. It does. It talks about like people who are pledged who seem to be coming from like like the captured peoples during the conquest. If they're vowed to God rather than taken as your personal property, like if someone tries to sell them, then they should be put to death rather than sold once they've been dedicated to God. So and this animals, anything dedicated to God, rather than ever it belonged to anyone else, it's to be put to death because it's
Nice.
already been marked out for God.
Well, and I think that gets into especially the water, further into like the undisturbed water imageries. There's this kind of purity of conscience
Right.
or consciousness itself, that it requires that kind of that stillness to be able to kind of reflect what is going on in that spiritual world of pure act, that you can't, that's the inarticulate reality. It's the spirit that nobody knows where it comes from or where it's going. But the reflective act of consciousness
Right.
itself, in the purity of consciousness, is that ability to then reflect the activity of spirit. And then once that reflective activity has kind of taken seat within the self, that's where the book flows from, right?
Right.
Well, you
And you
know,
can
from
see
that
this beyond spiritual,
gnosis.
beyond the application of this to the spiritual realm. You can see this as a principle of like how we accomplish really anything worthy
Yeah,
of accomplishing. It begins with some flash of intuition. We
Mm-hmm.
don't know where it came from. Um, you know, we have no
Mm-hmm.
idea. So it's like has that aspect of the spirit,
Mm-hmm.
and then we think about it. We can't we you know we commit it to our memory, and then we we move into action to do
we
Mm-hmm.
something with
articulate it.
it. And then if we have truly mastered whatever it is we're doing, then we reach the last stage where it's like we're able to try to explain all the steps we've gone through in order to show someone else how to do what we have done,
Mm-hmm.
You
so that
know,
it becomes repeatable.
Yeah.
when I was reading about the water and the spirit thing, the first thing that came to my mind was the walking on water,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
and the crystal sea in Revelation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, in
Right.
light of what he's talking about here, the water is this interaction between reflection and gnosis, right? And I mean, the gospel to me is the verse in I think it's 1 Corinthians 13 at the end, where he says, one day we will know as we are known. That's the that's the good news for me, because that's all I want, right? I want to know as I am known. And I think that walking on water is like that. It's knowing as you are known, right? Like that's like the ultimate form of gnosis. I don't know what you guys think, but that's what came to my mind, because like in this case, in what he's talking about, the water is still, it has to be still, right? So
Yes.
that you can reflect in it. But in any higher state of consciousness, I think that water would be like the crystal sea. It would be solid. It would be unified, right? All that multiplicity would be unified enough that you could actually stand on it and walk on it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Right. I want to talk for a moment um about the connection between contemplation and memory, because some of the things that he says about memory in this chapter really captured me. Like, I for the first time in my life, I think I understand why Christ says at the Last Supper, do this in remembrance of me,
Nice.
in a way that like so let me just kind of like I think actually highlighted some quotes on that about what he says
Sure.
about memory. So he has some. Okay, here we go. Make sure. Okay, yeah. So he says, in fact, there are two types of memory: horizontal memory, which renders the past present, and vertical memory, which renders that which is above present below. And then he quotes Bergson, and this is the part that really got me. Pure memory is a spiritual manifestation. With memory, we are in very truth in the domain of the spirit.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of that David Bentley Hart quote that I transcribed from a video that I was watching of him once about Memoria.
Yeah. We lost Jed.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys.
Okay, no problem.
I was listening to you. I just
No problem.
had to take care of some things here on the home front. So people are not seeing me right now. Let me
Yeah,
get the video going.
no problem.
I mean, it's a pretty picture.
So what do you guys think about that idea of like memory being the manifestation of spirit?
Yeah. So one of my favorite kind of German Old Testament scholars, kind of out of the Bardian school, is a guy named Hans Joachim Kraus, and his work was predominantly in the Psalms. So he's got a commentary on the Psalms and then a book on the theology of the Psalms.
Mm-hmm.
And he spends a lot of time talking about like the function of memory in the Psalms, right? Is that he ties it into actualization, right? And ties especially like, so the importance of like God's saving acts in the history of Israel, primarily the Exodus event, right? Is the, in a sense, in the Passover meal, the Exodus is reenacted. It's brought from its past into the present moment. And so like the power of memory, and that does tie into like the Eucharistic meal as well, is that we are connected to the Passion event. We're actualizing it in the present, right? And so it's not just like kind of recalling what happened back then. That's not memory in the biblical sense. It's really not how, I believe that the Hebrew term is zakar, right? So Zechariah, remember the Lord. These are kind of the, it's far more about bringing the past into the present.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's more like, it reminds me of the Orthodox tradition of saying, Christ is among us, Christ is risen.
There's another Bergson quote about that. Like, let's see here.
Yeah, Bergson is really strong on memory. Like his whole his essay on Introduction to Metaphysics really hits on like how memory is actually vital to cognitive.
Just to echo what you were just saying, this is another Bergson quote from the chapter. The truth is that memory does not consist in a regression from the present to the past, but on the contrary, is a progress from the past to the present.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking about the horizontal and the vertical memory that he's talking about there, I can't help but think of the cross.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And so the horizontal is the movement from past to present, and then the vertical is the above and the below.
It's
like
actually
Christ.
past the future on that diagram in the first chapter. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because in the Orthodox tradition, when you make the sign of the cross, you go above, below, end, beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You join the end to the beginning. And I'm actually now quite convinced that is conscious, right? Yeah. That movement is conscious, because Origen talks about that. You can't understand the beginning unless you understand the end, right? So he brings everything full circle. And when I saw that chart in here, I was just like, oh my goodness, that's what that is.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's so fascinating about that too, I was just listening to one of Hart's interviews from Tradition and Apocalypse. It was a short interview, but he discussed a paper that he's going to be presenting at a theological conference out in Ireland, and it fits well within kind of his whole thrust in Tradition and Apocalypse, is that we need to remember the future in order. I forget what he titled it. In order to understand our past,
right.
And I think it gets into a little bit of what he's talking about, even within the chapter. I think, like, without coming out and saying it fully directly, I think what he's talking about is that the kingdom itself is consciousness, right? And so I'll read. This comes from early in the chapter on page 30. when he's referencing Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus.
Yeah.
He says, this is why the conversation, or let me back up a little bit. In order to know from where the breath of the Spirit comes and where it goes, water is required to reflect it. So that's the fire imagery of the Spirit, water imagery of reflectivity of consciousness itself. This is why the conversation of the Master with Nicodemus, to which we have referred, enunciates the absolute condition for the conscious experience of the divine spirit or the kingdom of God. Mm. And he cites John 3:5 that says, truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. Truly, truly, the Master refers here twice to truth in this mantric, that is magical formula of the reality of consciousness. By these words, he states that full consciousness of the truth is the result of inbreathed truth from the Spirit and reflected truth from the water, right? And so I think that like some of what Hart is even talking about there is like when we remember our future, right? That final destination where God is all in all, the eschatological horizon, we call that into memory, which means we're bringing the future into the present. And we tie that into the past memory of the Eucharistic meal that we're calling the past into the present as well. I think what ultimately ends up happening, if you kind of follow Tomberg's logic here, is that the kingdom of God is typified in our conscious awareness. And so the kingdom itself is consciousness as it's truly meant to function. And so in a sense, like when we kind of live in our illusory world that we're in now, is that we're not fully conscious and we're not fully aware yet. And
well, is that the let the dead bury the dead? Like that is what that is to me. You know?
Right. We're not there. It's like it's the mixture of illusion in the real world that makes consciousness such a slippery thing. But I think that the arrival of the kingdom is also the arrival of the kingdom in its fullness is also expressed in like our conscious awareness. And I think that kind of in a sense is the parousia, is the second coming.
Yeah.
Where what is not only, Christ descending from the clouds, but also within us is this emerging conscious awareness of the intimate relationship that God has with the world. That these are not, God and the world are not separate, but they exist.
It's a movement that allows us to say with the Spirit, even so come.
Like Jesus says, the kingdom is within you, and then again, I'm thinking about, because these little things really tell me a lot about ancient Christianity, because in the Orthodox Church, they don't preach the book of Revelation. It doesn't come out in the liturgy. But my priest said to me that it's actually the whole building, the architecture, and the liturgy is modeled after the cosmic liturgy in the book of Revelation, right? So whenever you walk in to the church, you're walking into the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there it is again. You have above, below, future joined to the past, and then you go into the church and you walk into the future, right? And you talk about Christ is among us. Christ is risen, right? So there's this, and I have to say, like, this is one of the first things that really hit me when I started reading some of the church fathers, especially Origen, was just the cosmic nature of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Of like, we never really put much emphasis on the idea of time and space, but they did.
Oh yeah.
Oh, they totally did,
Well, it's the setting in which it's all taking place. And even there within the Orthodox Church, well, in any church that, includes kind of a robust iconography, is the past is there as well, but it's the living past, right? The saints and the angels and Christ himself represented, in the iconography of the church. They're living in present there. It's not the people that lived back.
Well, right. And as Tomberg says in the text, like the purpose of the horizontal memory is to make the past present.
I mean, they are part of that cosmic liturgy. They are the great cloud of witnesses. That's why they're there.
Yeah.
They're actually right out of the book. Yeah. And my priest said to me, people will say to him, oh, I can't make it to liturgy, Father, because I have a baseball practice or something, he'll be like, oh, you're gonna, you have to come. It's the end of the world. It's the apocalypse, right? And of course, apocalypse isn't just the end. It's a revelation, right?
It's not even primarily the end. I think we,
Right.
It is the end. He said it's every Sunday is the end of the world. Every Sunday, it's the end of the world. You go in, something
the end
ends,
of the false world, I would say.
Begins.
Well,
Right?
and every moment carries within itself a kind of apocalypse, right?
Exactly.
It's revealing something about reality, and then the moment
what the present is.
and the new moment arrives, and it is a new apocalypse. And so we live in this kind of in an apocalyptically saturated world, right? And as a kind of somebody who's very drawn into apocalyptic thinking, and that's definitely a huge part of just my own spiritual formation, it is definitely like in our context we think apocalypse, we think the end, but the apocalypse is always now. It's always the revelatory act of God in the world now.
That's right. That's why Jesus says that, right? Behold, I make all things new, because it's the end and the begin. Like, you're always, the present is the end and the beginning. Like, it's right in between those two things, so it's always apocalyptic.
Yeah, and I see that kind of whatever that future arrival of the kingdom in its fullness. To me, it signifies, in a sense, a kind of an awakening to what is already present, because Christ already has made all things new.
Well, that's like you said, Jed. You said that the dead let the dead bury their dead, right? We're not fully conscious, right? Well, what does that mean? We're not awake.
Yeah.
Right. And so when you move into that present moment, it's a waking feeling, right?
And that comes out of Zechariah, like the quote out of Zechariah that's so closely tied with both kind of the Olivet discourse and then the apocalyptic imagery in Revelation. And I think that is the awakening moment, is they will look on him whom they have pierced and mourn for him as for like an only son, right? Is there comes a point in the collective experience where we realize and we awaken to the reality of what Christ in the world has always signified. And of course, we all pierced him, right? And we had to. But the mourning of that, I think, is that we didn't even recognize it. We didn't recognize that kind of the cosmic reality of Christ that is already has been planted within the world, and it's signified in the sacred rites and rituals of the church. And so we're saturated with it all the time, but we're half awake to it, and sometimes not awake to it at all. But I think that and so I see that in this chapter is kind of, and really in Tom Burke's entire writing, is this kind of this stream of consciousness that he's existing within, that's trying to drive at a different way of understanding the spiritual life than kind of our modern context. Like, I don't think that Tom Burke's saying anything particularly new, but it's new for us.
Well, he is marrying art and science and religion.
Yeah.
Says, right.
And I think that's really within the sense of what the kingdom is in its kind of its Catholicity.
Yeah.
It's encompassing everything.
Yeah.
So it's not just what we would understand the sacred to be. It's the baseball game, right? Yeah, go to church, go to liturgy, but then go to the baseball game, because there's something apocalyptic in that too. Is everything
right
within that living reality, and we just don't see it.
Right, because that's why Bach says that it's not just when Christ comes, it's not just Christ that arrives, but it's the entire supersensible world. And what we come to see in the fullness of kingdom is the inseparable unity between heaven and earth, between the sensible and the supersensible.
That kind of segues like directly into like his next section in the chapter on duality, right?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing about that, because like when I started into contemplation, which wasn't at all like a conscious decision on my part. It just happened to me, right? And I think you said something there that triggered this, Nate. You said something like, all the super sensible comes crashing in, right? Not just Christ. Well, here, this is my blueberry story, right? Like, I remember thinking there were no blueberries on our property. And then, I don't know, 15 years down the road, I saw a blueberry one day, and then I saw millions of blueberries, and they were all right there. And I'd walked that way so many times. And then I looked up and I saw a dogwood tree, which the year before I had seen one on our driveway and thought, what is this? I've never seen one of these. And I looked it up, and it's a dogwood and native to BC. But I was like, well, that's weird. How come we have a dogwood all of a sudden? And anyway, so I saw the blueberry, and then I saw millions of blueberries, and then I looked up and I saw another dogwood. And the whole world came crashing in, Nate, like, at the same time. It was bizarre. I was like, what? I was overwhelmed. Right.
Yeah, and it's kind of the apocalyptic formula, even like you see in the book of Revelation, is I looked and I saw. Sorry about that, but yeah, I looked and I saw. And the look and see, like, yes. You have to do both. You have to, like, your eyes have to be open, but you have to perceive what is in front of you. And oftentimes, like, that is where we live in that half. We're looking, but we're not seeing. Seeing, they do not see. Mm-hmm. Right? But John in that apocalyptic formula is doing both. He's looking and he's seeing. He's seeing and he's perceiving what he's actually looking at.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what Christ is initiating, the enzyme of the cross itself, the catalyst of the cross itself, is this awakening agent that allows us to actually see what is always been, but is kind of like the dogwoods or the blueberries on your property. Right. They were probably always there.
They were always there.
But it's
and then like 2 months later, I found a whole jungle of dogwoods, and they were right behind the barn. And the thing that got me about this was that it was like God was teaching me something.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and also I just want to say this in the context of this idea of future, as David Bentley Hart is talking about it in Tradition and Apocalypse, because he's not talking about like future in terms of some sort of like imaginative, speculative, open future. He's talking about it in terms of final causality.
Yeah.
So in the case of the Christian and the Jewish tradition, the final cause is kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
I just want that's pretty much it. I just wanted to make sure that was interjected, because I think it gives a little bit of extra context.
Well, and I think that's really, even in our own time, in some of the discussions we've been having outside of, the context of, in some of our other side discussions that we've been having, I won't get too much into that, but is like the imperative, I think, especially for the Christian community in our time, is to begin to remember the kingdom. Yes. Right? Because like we are existing in kind of one of those chaotic inflection points within history, where the pull is for us to look for the next social arrangement, the next political theory, the next, because everything is in flux, and the opportunity that's in front of us is to, in a sense, like, I think of it kind of in terms of like the way the world was changing under the settlement of Constantine, right? Is that the church had kind of, in a sense, had won. They had emerged victorious through the crisis of the 3rd century, but had not fully contemplated what the meaning of the kingdom was.
Right. So we're still doing, that's still the work we're doing.
So
that's still the work we're doing.
The church, in a sense, it's not about winning history, but there's this overcoming of history that is implicit within Jewish and Christian apocalyptic thought, that the goal is we had to re-enter history, in a sense, right? And I think the temptation for the Christian community is to look for the solution within history as opposed to from beyond history. this kind of eruption. We're looking for that eruptive movement, that inbreaking movement of the kingdom here and now.
Right.
And the question then becomes, for me, is the question of, well, how does that get embodied? Because I think that's kind of
I got the answer.
well, then fire away, Sherry.
Okay, Sherry.
This is what I learned about with my blueberries and my dogwoods, boys. I never saw those because I walked the same path. And then I struck out on new paths.
Right.
For different reasons. And also the landscape around me was evolving and changing because of, there's like ecological reasons for that, right? Logging and watershed changes, blah, blah, blah. But
and because just really quick, Sherry, and then please continue. If you set on a different path, that means there was a change in what you were seeking. Otherwise,
yes,
you would not have changed your path.
I was seeking food for my goats. Okay. And I learned very quickly that they were better at finding it than me. So I began to follow them. Okay. And they led me to places. And all of a sudden I'm standing in a jungle of dogwood trees along a creek that I didn't even know we had. Right. And it was right behind my barn. And God said to me, you see things hidden from the foundations of the world. Mm-hmm. That's what you're finding, right?
Well, is there anything more spectacular than dogwoods in bloom?
Yeah, and the thing is, they're not there, mm-hmm. And they're actually thriving, right? Even though I don't know they're there,
right?
And so, to me,
this is very much that's the perfect image for our relationship with the perfect concrete image for our relationship to the supersensible world.
Exactly.
Just like your dogwoods and your blueberries, it's there the whole time. Mm-hmm. We're just not seeing it.
That's right. And so what I'm saying is you can't teach people how to do that. Nobody could have taught me how to do that. You can tell them about what goats need to eat and I don't even know, like, it's a journey.
They have to do what you do, what you did, Sherry. They just have to trust like their intuition to go out on a different path and to have their eyes open.
This is what I wanted to say, actually. Now, thank you for cueing me, because it's courage, and it's courage and humility.
Right. Well, that's why he says that he talks about the daring, because this is the mystical part, right? So this is connected to the first arcanum, which is the magician. And what is the characteristic of the magician? The magician dares.
Yes, exactly. And so I had to have the courage to strike out on that unknown path, and the humility to follow my goats.
Right.
Not lead them.
Right. And I really do think that the mystical encounter cannot help but lead to a profound humility. Because you can't accept, but there is nothing for you to experience except
what? There's nothing more humbling than finding a stand of dogwood trees that you thought didn't exist. Okay? Like, seriously. Or blueberries. You're like, oh man, I gotta go tell all those people that I said we don't have blueberries on our property. I gotta go tell them we do, and I'm dumb.
What's funny about that is it reminds me of, like, sometimes, like, in those spaces where you're having that mystical experience, is, I don't know if, and it just reminds me of, like, your dogwood story, Sherry, is like there's an element when you've come onto the other side of that experience, there's like that moment where you're like, duh.
Yeah.
It was there all the time, and like I just wasn't seeing it. You know what I mean? And there's a kind of this playfulness and humor to the mystical life, where it's just like you're constantly hit with these surprises that, like, just these earth-shattering insights. Like, oh my God, there are dogwood trees on my property, and then there's the next moment is they've been there the whole time and I haven't seen them.
Yeah, and not just like for a few months, but like 15 years, okay? Like, it's like God was just rubbing salt in my wound,
Yeah, so you can't get too like real mystical experience has a way of deflating the ego, because it's
And
like,
we have that with the scripture. We read the
Yeah.
scripture and we go, whoa, that was there the whole time.
yeah,
Yep. Absolutely. I have that experience with the scriptures the whole time. Like this morning when I'm reading this and it's like, oh, this is why Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. It's like,
Yes.
I never knew why that word remembrance was there.
Yeah.
Never. I glossed over it like literally hundreds of times.
it's maybe like one of the most vital words in
And like
the entire formula.
literally every time I attend mass. It's like,
It was a blueberry, Nate. It was a
and
blueberry.
it's like, right, yeah. It's like, oh yeah. It's just like I just, and even though I mean I am, it's not like my way of thinking about memory wasn't complex or nuanced either.
Well,
I
it was
knew
so
that memory was a deep subject, but I just never quite had it as clear as Tomberg puts it in this chapter. And the minute I heard that, I'm like, oh, this is precisely why Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me.
Yeah.
well, it kind of, I know I might step on some toes here with this one, but it kind of, it renders certain aspects of our sacramental theology a little bit silly, like how we will get into substance and accidents and how Christ is present in the
Exactly.
elements and all that kind of stuff, that we get very abstract and
Right.
ornate. How is
Yeah,
he
it's the presence that matters. It doesn't, the precise like explanation of the
present?
presence is secondary.
He's present in memory.
Yes.
Right.
It is through memory that Christ is present with us now.
Yeah.
The memory is not like some, it's not the succession from present to past. It is the past joining us here in the present. That is what the act of memory is. And so,
And
yeah,
also joining the above and below through the vertical axis of memory.
and this isn't like an argument against transubstantiation. I agree with the real presence, however you want to construe it, right? But like, it's in a way, it's kind of us getting cute metaphysically when like the answer is really right there. It is that act of memory is the actualization of the real in the present.
Right. I think the only thing that you need to understand is that is present in the absolute now and present and the union of heaven and earth. Like that's how you understand that philosophically is kind of secondary.
It is, and I think that that's, yeah. Go ahead, Shari. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, like, I often say, I don't think that matters. And a lot of, so like if somebody would bring up like transubstantiation, I would say, I don't think that matters. And
that's basically what John Bear said in his conversation with Sam.
Well, it's
right. It's like he hit on that in his conversation with Sam, which was excellent.
Like the dogwood trees that are thriving behind my barn, and I don't know that they're there. Right? Does it matter that I know they're there? No, it doesn't. Right. Like the knowledge of reality that I have, the grasp that I have on reality doesn't affect reality at all. Right? Whether or not, it might affect me, it might be helpful in my own transformation, but it doesn't affect what's actually going on. And that's why I can say with confidence most of the time that it doesn't matter.
So I want to push back on this a little bit, Shari. And this isn't me being pedantic or anything like that, but I was thinking about how I think it does matter that we're aware. I think it actually,
as I said, it's helpful to me in my transformation.
Right. And so it is, but then once you become aware, so like Paul in Romans 8 talks about the creation groans for the arrival of the sons of God, right? In that sense, like when we become aware of ourselves, like for right now, reality goes unimpeded with or without us. It kind of is what it is. But when we become conscious and aware of reality, we exist within kind of that matrix of reality where then we are kind of positively engaged in affecting the nature of reality itself.
Okay, so this is interesting because this is actually where he goes next when he talks about being and the good. He talks about Moses and Plato, right?
Yeah, that's the one I brought up on Voxer because that just was like,
You know what was really interesting was what I watched a video on, I'm not even going to try to say his name, Hermes T.
Trismegistus.
I'm going to call him Hermes T. And so the guy was explaining him, and he drew a chart, like a little diagram, and he had two arrows pointing to the center and Hermes in the middle, Moses here and Plato here. And what Hermes does, or Hermeticism, let's say, is it joins the two, right? Being and the good, or fact and morality. And so when I gave that example of whether or not the dogwoods are affected by my knowledge of them, right? That's me in being. I'm talking about what is, okay? And then Jed comes along and says, but, and there's Jed over there in Plato, right?
Yeah.
And he's talking about the morality of that. Is that moral that you just think like that, right? You need, and so these two things have to come together. And they're joined in Hermeticism, which is really interesting because, and then he points it out as the objective and the subjective, right? The law, Moses, and the good. And what joins them, what Hermeticism is love. It's, well, it isn't, but it's representative of love. That's what
brings he does
together.
I mean,
that's
how
Talmud
says it is love. And he says that love has primacy, which also points to the primacy of the person, by the way, which means that you actually can't have a world at all without a person.
He actually, like,
which is where I would agree with Jed in saying, like, no, your experience of the dogwoods and the blueberries matters.
Well, it does matter,
and
but it doesn't matter to them.
Oh yes, it does.
It does.
It absolutely matters to the blueberries.
They delight in being seen.
Well, it did matter to them because my goats ate them.
But it ties back to, like, if you think about, like, so Tomberg is actually really, there's some pretty radical things that he says metaphysically in this chapter.
Yep.
Is he actually places love has primacy over being.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and it solves duality, right?
And it also made me, this chapter made me become more comfortable with the beyond being language in talking about God than I ever have been.
Yeah, me too.
Because now I understood why some church fathers choose that beyond being language, because they use the beyond being language because they're pointing to love.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, and what's interesting too is how this will come out throughout the book, is there's a logical flow, and even the cards themselves in most decks are numbered, right? With the magician being the first card. Well, the magician, if you think about, like, that high priestess, kind of the consciousness that the high priestess is signifying, what the magician is doing is the magician is an active agent within reality, able to affect reality in a meaningful way, right? And so, and that's really,
how do you get that first,
what's that?
I'm just curious, how do you get that from the magician, that he affects reality?
Right, because that's what magic is, right? Magic is the ability to kind of understand reality and then to make use of it, affect, like, within a healthy spiritual context where you're not engaging in sorcery, is you're affecting the material world, and not just the material, but also the spiritual world.
He says that magic is when you make the inner life exterior, right?
Right. And so like this manifestation of the spiritual reality into material reality is kind of, it's emblematic of what
I'm not quite sure about that, because the magician is associated with the first arcanum.
Right.
And I think it's associated with mysticism, which is the direct experience. It's not, magic doesn't come in until the chapter we're doing next, the third arcanum, right? The Empress. That's where magic comes in.
So like, and back me up if I'm wrong here, but I think he's also arguing
there's an unconsciousness to what the magician does. You have to keep that in mind, right? Yes. So that's why he's one. Now we bring in the consciousness with the high priestess, right? So the magician really represents the mystical experience, where it's inarticulable, it's fully participatory, but you have no way of, you're doing something, you can't explain what you're doing, you have no idea how you do it.
It's a child.
Right,
Right.
exactly. The child who turns work into play, all of
Yeah.
that. And then the consciousness comes in here with the priestess, who is like the reflection upon that.
Mm.
Mhm.
And then the projection of that into the world, which you're totally right about what you're talking about there, that comes in not with the magician, but with the
With the
empress.
But I also think that and I think this fits within some of his references into numerology as well,
Okay.
is that the first arcana contains all the other
Correct.
arcana,
That is true.
right? And
Right.
so that's
He
kind
does say
of
that.
the whole path is contained within, like, the objective in the arcana is to become the magician. And so you're kind of initiated into the journey in that first card, and then the second movement is consciousness. And so I think that a lot of what we're talking about in this book is really the unpacking of that first chapter and the full implications of what it means to be truly a magician, or in that sense truly spiritual, you
Right.
know.
And because the magician is the key, because without that, without the experience, without the mystical experience, without the actual experience of God, there's
contemplation.
there's nowhere for you to go. But
Right.
you will automatically go astray without that. You'll
Well, then
create
you
an
have
idol.
intellectual. Then you have intellectual thinking without images.
Right, exactly. You will create an idol.
Yeah.
Right. And there's the kind of because the magician is the youth, right? Kind of like the fool as well, but the magician is the youth. Is it goes back into, like, unless you become like the child, you cannot enter the
Right,
kingdom,
right,
right? And so there's
right.
this because there, in the journey of the arcana, like, you go through the whole stage, all the stages of life are encapsulated in the arcana itself, but always trying to return us back to that eternal youth that is
Yes,
the kingdom.
which is
And
the Eden consciousness, basically.
yeah, yeah.
Which is also reminiscent of Douglas Harding's 4 stages of life.
Oh,
That's why I brought it up
100%
last.
for sure.
Yeah.
And in a sense, those four stages are really operative in us
So
simultaneously.
let's get into this. Let's see if I can find this. Okay, let's get into this being and love and duality bit. So he talks about, like, the kind of like the kind of bad duality,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Good and
And
evil.
then he says, this is again in terms of, he's okay. Two is all this, and it is even more. Not only is the number two not necessarily the illegitimate twofoldness described by Samatan, but it is also the number of love and the fundamental condition of love, which it necessarily presupposes and postulates. Because love is inconceivable without the lover and the loved, without me and you, without one and the other.
Mm-hmm.
If God were only one, and if he had not created the world, he would not be the God revealed by the Master, the God of whom St. John says, God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. He would not be this, because he would love no one other than himself. As this is impossible from the point of view of the God of love, he is revealed to the human consciousness as the eternal Trinity, the loving one who loves, the loved one who loves, and their love who loves them, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It is because God is love that he admits of no comparison, that he surpasses all power, wisdom, and even being. One can, if one chooses, speak of the power of love, the wisdom of love, and the life of love, in order to make a distinction between the three persons of the Holy Trinity, but one cannot put on the same level love on the one hand and wisdom, power, and being on the other. For God is love, and it is love, and it is only love, which by its presence gives worth and power to wisdom and to being itself. For being without love is deprived of all worth. Being without love would be the most appalling torment, the inferno itself.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I mean, that this whole section within the chapter was like, it just, like, in that radical statement in First John that God is love, right? You are already, like, if you take that, I think, in the broadest sense that John is is inviting us into, is you are automatically brought into, like, it, your monism is already always a multiplicity. There's already, duality is already within. You have the dialectic between lover and the beloved, and that interplay, it goes all the way down. That interplay is already within God.
Well, this is huge, because this means that necessarily, if you're thinking along these lines, it means relation is primary over substance,
Mm-hmm.
and that the subjective is primary over the objective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that relationship precedes being.
Yes.
Is it primary,
you
or
being without relationship?
Is it like, this is a question, like, because of that idea of being and the good being joined in love, is one primary over the other? Because being is objective and the good is subjective, right? So is one actually primary, or are they conjoined?
I view them as simultaneities, right? There, you don't have one without the other,
Right.
and so and that's where I think, like, the beyondness, once again, Nate, is like, the beyondness is that it's beyond finite, the finite ability to fully conceive of. So there's always this infinite excess in the divine reality.
Well, let me just here he goes on a little bit further. Does love therefore surpass being? How could one doubt this after the revelation of this truth through 19 centuries by the mystery of Calvary? That which is below is like to that which is above. And is not the sacrifice of his life, his terrestrial being, accomplished through love by God incarnate? Is this not the demonstration of the superiority of love over being? And is not the resurrection the demonstration of the other aspect of the primacy of love over being, i.e., that love is not only superior to being, but also that it engenders and restores it? So that might be. So you were talking, you got that about being, the unity of being in love. That's coming from what you were reading about Hermes.
The good. I was talking about the good and being,
right,
being brought together in love, right?
Right. But Tomberg links the idea of the Platonic good to love, because love is the ultimate of, like, love is like the pinnacle of the good. So ultimately, if you're thinking about the Platonic good in the right way, it will ultimately lead you to this concept of love, which is the highest possible conception of the good.
And if you think of the Mosaic being, it'll also lead you to that concept, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the thing. Like, this is what this diagram is saying. The reason that it jogged my memory was because he also described Plato's good as subjective, and Moses's being as objective. And you had mentioned that, right, that the subjective is primary over the objective, and I'm wondering, because in love loves unto purity, right? It looks to the object of its affection. So it seems to me that it's neither one of those things is less
to
important.
Say that love is primary is not to negate being.
No, I know.
It's just saying that the dependency.
It wasn't
the dependency is being is ultimately dependent on love.
Right. You actually, Nate, you didn't say love was primary. You said the subjective was primary over the objective.
Oh, gotcha.
That's why I'm doing this.
I said that because of the link to. I said that because of the link to the Platonic good, and also, like, love can only be known. Something which is not a subject cannot know love.
Well, love becomes what it touches, right?
Right. So that it has to
be beloved. The beloved is simply what love touches, right? And so it's love. It's the divine eros, the engendering reality that gives rise to being itself. So the first movement of consciousness and of conscious awareness is love. It's not, love does exist. It has to exist prior to being.
Yes, because this is what I'm saying.
Which means whatever is primary cannot be only a unity. This is what I've been talking about this like the whole time I've been on the Boxer.
That he says. This is the legitimate twofoldness that he's talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
it's the dialectical monism. It's the unity within duality.
Right, but
It's not the,
Gilchrist has that great phrase where he talks about the non-duality that still contains duality.
yeah,
Yes.
the one, and it gets into that in kind
It's
of
a
his,
unity of essence.
like the number one in numerology contains all the other numbers, right?
Right.
So every number that follows one is simply an expression, is already pre-contained within one. So all the potentiality of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, so on and so forth, that is all pre-contained within the one.
Mhm.
That's the potential that is realized, and can only be, the one can only be expressed in multiplicity, because you really, aside from just one, then you don't have anything else, right? And I think he gets into that in his concept of like what he calls Christian yoga, which is kind of different from the Vedantic schools that kind of recede into this, into like a kind of a oneness that eliminates the multiplicity, and the dissolution of difference, right? Is that the way the Christian metaphysic is a little bit different, is it is always assuming the difference principle, and it has to assume the difference principle within being, because Christian metaphysics are founded and truly an expression of divine love that is prior
Right.
to being itself.
And when you're thinking this way, this makes like a lot of like this changes the game for a lot of metaphysical and theological questions too. Like whether God necessarily creates. If you're understanding that God's nature is love and you're
Yeah.
taking that seriously, I don't see how you could not answer that question in the affirmative.
Yeah, the whole question of modal collapse, like,
Yeah, I
God is,
noticed. I had a very similar discussion with Tom like earlier in the week.
yeah, yeah, the necessity of that, the idea that like, that it somehow runs metaphysically afoul to say God is bound by some kind of necessity. And it's like, well, that's kind of the wrong question to begin with,
Right.
Yes.
Because
because
there's talk of necessity when you're talking like there is no necessity in love, but and yet at the same time there's no contingency either.
yeah,
Well, that's
it's
why
love.
I constantly quote George MacDonald with that love loves unto purity, because that it 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 seems like a necessity,
Yeah,
right? That
love is
love,
the absolute and infinite expression of what it loves,
and it
right?
never
So there's,
stops moving, right? Like
yeah.
it's always making, like George says, it's making whatever is not lovely, it makes more lovely,
Hmm.
Right.
so that it can get its fill of loving. Okay, that's how he puts it. And if you think about it in those terms, it can't stop.
So the Beatles were right. All we need is love, right?
Well, yeah, so
That's
long
it.
as you understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's like the
yeah,
problem is that like I mean, theologically conservative people who like roll their eyes at that kind of thing, like they roll their eyes at that kind of thing because neither they nor the people they're objecting to understand love properly.
well,
yeah.
see,
If
I
you
don't like to
actually
think about
understood
it in
love, you would
terms of,
realize that that's a true statement. And I'm not saying the Beatles did when they sang that song either.
Well, like, but if you're conceiving of it properly, you're talking about the dynamic power that gives rise to everything, and
Right.
you,
like, so it's, is it a necessity? Because there is an implication in that there's a lack, right? And that's not what this is. There is no lack. It's a forward motion, right? This is why God is pure act, because he can't stop, right? He has to love that which
Right.
is love.
So not only, yeah, and God is God and being, as love is the ultimate necessity. But yet I would say like his actions are also of necessity dictated by his nature.
Right.
well, I think that it's, I actually, I would push back and say that what is necessary is the divine freedom and its absolute, that there's no constraint on the infinite nature of God's love,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And when we're talking about, yes, necessity is not an inappropriate term, but I think it's an inadequate term.
Yes,
I
it
think so
is.
too.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just, that's not, I think that that's kind of where, like, especially in, kind of Thomistic metaphysics of pure act, and that's really where the question of modal collapse begins to develop in
Right.
earnest, is what's missing there is that, no, it's actually, this is the freedom to love and to love in the infinite, to the
Well, see,
infinite.
I think this is connected to the magician because the childlikeness in the sense of play, right? Because like so it's simultaneously somehow, and I don't know how to. It's simultaneously necessity because it's dictated by the nature. I mean, necessity may be an adequate term, but it's still gratuity
Well, it's necessity in the sense that your
because
bladder
it's also
has
completely
to
superfluous
necessarily
and
empty itself.
needless.
And there's a lensing there, because I think you, from one lens, it will appear as necessity, but from the other lens, it appears as freedom in the absolute.
Right.
Well, he gets into that when he talks about pantheism, emanationism, demiurgism, right? They're all
Yeah, he brings about.
standalones. As standalones, they don't work, right? And then he says, what is it here? I gotta put my glasses on.
I think I have that highlighted.
Oh, it's ex nihilo. Is like the you know the climax of doctrine, in his opinion, right? But it contains those things within it, right? And I was thinking about this Soloviev quote that I just short. He talks about this containing, like the one in, it's just the one in the many, right? Like you have all these ideas, and as standalones, they don't make any sense, but within the whole, they function. So he says, to repeat according to the meaning of the religious idea, the reunification of separate entities and particular principles and forces with the absolute principle, and then this gets to what you were talking about, Nate, must be free. This
Yep.
means that these separate entities and particular principles must by their own will arrive at reunification and absolute harmony, must of themselves deny their own exclusiveness, their own self-assertion or egoism. The way to salvation, to the realization of true equality, true liberty, and fraternity is self-denial. But self-denial requires a prior self-assertion. Anyway, that's getting into different waters there. But he talks about how you have these separate entities and particular principles, and they must come in they must come into the absolute principle, right? But that movement has to be free. I mean, we could get off on a tangent with that quote because I just love it. But
No, I did like that section where he talks about like the way in which all of the principles of creation are partially true. He does give primacy to the creation as ex nihilo though. But he
yeah,
does
he
show
says
how.
that's the climax of all doctrine,
Right.
because it's magic, right? Because
Yeah, it's a
something is
magical
born of
act which
nothing,
comes out of love for him.
right?
Well, what's interesting to me too, and I kind of, I think like in terms of like, um, there's an inherent, there's a practical outworking of this, and I think that it becomes really like, if love is primary to being, then it also becomes kind of the animating principle behind every expression of being, right? It
Right.
is being, it's what brings being into being. And so, and I think of that kind of in our context, like kind of echoing back on this question of how is the kingdom realized? It's when love becomes the operating principle through which we arrange our
It's
lives.
also the key to understanding what person is conceptually.
Yes, yes. And so there, like, in our world, like in a sense, there is like underneath all of the tensions in our world right now, you can say is there's a kind of a realpolitik that is animating all of it, in all of its brutality. It
Right.
iterates itself differently in different cultural and political arrangements, but what is absent in all of that is a love that is ordered unto the good and to the flourishing of being, right?
Yeah,
And
but is it linear though? Like I just keep thinking about this. Being and good stand in opposition to each other too, right? Because one is fact, like a stone is, right? it just is. It exists. And then the good stands in opposition to that sometimes. We know that, right? Because there are things that are morally wrong or corrupt. And we have a difficult time with those things. But if they are brought together, if they are knit together in love, then what you have literally is being good.
Right, well, that's
Right?
right. Well, when he's talking about the section you're talking about, which maybe it was because you're, I want to circle back around to what you were talking about earlier, because we should actually probably read that. There's actually the section where he talks about this different ways of looking at creation. I think it's important because it actually talks about naturalism
Yes.
and why naturalism goes wrong because it begins by looking at the world of facts. So that section's
Oh,
worth reading. But before that, really quick, there's this one section I wanted to highlight while we're still having this conversation about objectivity and subjectivity and love and being, because this summarizes very well like why I was unable to go down an Eastern non-dualist path and
Mm-hmm.
why I circled back around to Christianity.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
he says
So
that.
he says here, this is beginning at the bottom of page 35. Thales and Heraclitus have two different conceptions. The one sees in water the essence of things, and the other sees it in fire. But here, primarily, it it is so that the idea of the good in its summit love is due to the conception of the world as a moral process, whereas the idea of being and its summit, the God quiesce, is due to the conception of the world as that of a fact of nature. The idea of the good and love is essentially subjective. It is absolutely necessary to have had experience of psychic and spiritual life in order to be able to conceive of it. Whilst, as we have already indicated, the idea of being essentially objective, presupposes only a certain degree of outward experience, of the mineral realm, for example. The consequence of choosing between these two, I will not say points of view, but rather attitudes of soul, lies above all in the intrinsic nature of the experience of practical mysticism, which consequently derives from this choice. He who chooses being will aspire to true being, and he who chooses love will aspire to love. For 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 one only finds that for which one seeks. The seeker for true being will arrive at the experience of repose in being, and as there cannot be two true things, the illegitimate twofoldness of Saint Martin, or two separate co-eternal substances, but only one being and one substance, the center of false being will be suppressed. False being, ahamkara, or the illusion of the separate existence of the separate substance of the self. The characteristic of this is characteristic of the mystical way that one loses one's capacity to cry. An advanced pupil of yoga or Vedanta will forever have dry eyes, whilst the masters of Kabbalah, according to the Zohar, cry much and often. Christian mysticism speaks also of the gift of tears as a precious gift of divine grace. The master cried in front of the tomb of Lazarus. Thus, the outer characteristic of those who choose the other mystical way, that of the God of love, is that they have the gift of tears. This is in keeping with the very essence of their mystical experience. Their union with the divine, not in the absorption of their being by divine being, but rather the experience of the breath of divine love, the illumination by divine love, and the warmth of divine love. The soul which receives this undergoes such a miraculous experience that it cries. In this mystical experience, fire meets with fire. Then nothing is extinguished in the human personality, but on the contrary, everything is set ablaze. This is the experience of legitimate twofoldness, or the union of two separate substances in one sole essence. The
Mhm.
substances remain separate as long as they are bereft of that which is the most precious in all existence, free alliance and love.
Hmm. Yeah,
Right,
I
which is what
actually
Soloviev
made a
talks
note in
about,
that,
right?
like there when he talks about the substance essence, is like this is really like I'd made a note. This was actually when I first read through the book a while back. Is that the Sophianic character of what he's talking about? And I want to just pick up on this within the
Go for
card,
it. Yeah.
right? You have love and being,
Yeah.
Mhm.
the pillars of
Right.
the
Right.
right? They're always in a dialectical unity between the two, right? And so, and it is a, we don't get into the either or. It is the both and,
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
right? And I see that kind of, even within like the kind of the black and white imagery of the pillars themselves, of the Boaz pillar, is you have that kind of that dialectical unity of identity and differences. They're really manifestations of the one thing, the one temple. These are the two primary pillars of the one temple, and they're expressions of the whole reality. And so you have the identity and the difference. You have the binary. You could look at it in terms of like an analogy with binary code, is you have one and then you have its difference or its negation, which is zero, but it's simply the expression of the one,
Right.
through which everything flows from that dual principle. Then all
Well,
multiple.
they are actually masculine and feminine too, in essence.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, absolutely. And so that's where the black and the white are reminiscent of the yin and yang energy, which is masculine and feminine, and so that interplay, and that's imaged forth in creation, right? God made them male and female after His image, right?
Mhm.
And so, male and female after His image. So you have this kind of archetypal identity of,
They are taken out of each other,
right.
right? And like, to me, like that moment is what is when we're confronted with duality, and we have to wrestle with it, right? We have to, as Tomberg would say, we have to make it legitimate.
Yeah, and the illegitimate duality is the
Which
duality of
is,
good and evil. And I think that the legitimate duality, in a sense, is echoes of that masculine feminine principle that was, in a sense, Adam and Eve
well, it's love.
comprised the tree of knowledge.
Mhm.
They were the tree of knowledge. They didn't illegitimately need to go to good and evil in order to obtain that, because within themselves was the proper dual principle, and that they, in their one fleshness, was the living expression of God in the world.
Right. But as
Well, and there
Solovyov
was only
says
the good to
further,
know. So the very choice in conceiving of the option, of knowing good and evil is the choice of illusion over the reality.
well, I have a different take on that, because this is kind of what we talked about, Jed, in that private conversation, or private, when I talked to you about what I saw.
Mhm.
And if you talk about the salvation of Satan and his angels, right? That this is all about this to me, because Solovyov says it well here. He says the way to salvation, to the realization of true equality, is self-denial, but self-denial requires a prior self-assertion, which is what Adam and Eve did in the garden, right?
Right.
To deny one's own exclusive will, one must first have it. For the particular principles and forces to reunite freely with the absolute principle, they first must have separated from
Right.
it.
So there has to be a fall into duality in order
It
for
has to
there
be
to
the
be,
fall.
in order for there, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because I know how much I internally squirm at that concept. And I know that like most people do, but there is an inescapability and an inevitability of the fall, especially in that sense that Irenaeus casts it in, is it was pedagogical. It was necessary for the emergence of being into its.
Why else would you confront someone with duality? Right? Why else? What, like, if I had a child, what would be my purpose of taking something and ripping it in half and waiting and hoping that they can put it back together?
Well, you can see this, and I mean, to bring Harding back into this, you can see this in the development cycle of the person, right? So, I mean, this is why, I mean, the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, it's a myth. It's like we're all Adam and Eve,
Mhm.
you know?
Well, and that fall gets recapitulated down through history. We can look at, like we were talking
Right.
about a little bit yesterday with the Enlightenment, was kind of this recapitulation of Eden, this new consumption of the tree of knowledge
Mm-hmm.
Well, that is the U-shaped journey, right?
that precipitated,
That's the
in a sense,
pattern.
a fall into modernity. We fell into modernity
We fall
through,
all the time.
Right. Well,
right.
that you can see the evolution of consciousness narrative that like Barfield and Steiner is also another version of this, right? So you
Exactly.
have like the fall from participation to withdrawal participation toward the movement toward final participation.
It's birth, death, and resurrection. Birth,
Right.
death, and
Yeah.
resurrection.
Right. Right.
So that's what you have in the garden, and that's what you have on the cross, and that's what you have in Revelation, right? Job, story of the Israelites, it's just like a
I'm
myriad, and you
very
should.
tempted to attempt to quote something from chapter 3 here, but I'll wait until I'll hold off on it because it ties into what you were saying about both the concept of the redemption of the devil and Job. Tom,
Yeah.
just to give a little teaser, Tom Bergson says some very interesting stuff about Satan and the evil hierarchies in the next chapter.
Okay.
But I'll say so. Remind
Just
if when we talk about that, remind me of what
oh,
you were
sorry.
saying here, so that we can bring it back up and tie the
Okay.
conversations together.
But one little side note: Mary was a weaver, and the U shape is weaving.
Right.
And we talk about stories as weaving, right?
Mm-hmm.
Narratives are weaving together things, right? So I find that really quite fascinating. It's like when before we started, and I was telling you about, listening to the music, and
I love that.
because we only, this is the mirror, okay? The mirror is us looking into our existence, right? Into where we are, our place. And so if you spend time in the mirror, and you're nodding your head to the music, and then you go, oh, wait a minute, that's the sign for infinity, right? It's like, it's all there. I don't know how to say this. It's like the dogwood trees, right? It's all there. It's just waiting to be unveiled. And so, and it's always in it, it's always an image, like he says at the beginning of the chapter, right? Like mysticism is Gnosis is intellectualism without images, right? So you have to have this consortium of images, right, to work with. This is why you have a deck of tarot, right?
Right.
Because that's what that is. It's that consortium of images. Anyway, I'm just.
Well, do you guys mind if I share something? This kind of comes like kind of going back into the concept, and in a sense, the necessity of the fall, right? Is when I was in my early 20s, and like my fall experience was in a sense like the onset of the bipolar disorder that I deal with.
Mhm.
I wrote this little piece, and it's kind of, I wrote it, as a 22-year-old kid, but I knew that like there was some significance to it. It's really short, and it's very simple, but I think it echoes some of what we're talking about. So I wanted to bring it in, if that's okay.
Oh yeah, go for it.
So this was kind of like an autobiographical, in a not a very straightforward way, an autobiographical poem I wrote called "A River's Course." And start out with the quote from Rainier Rilke that says, "Be patient toward all that is unresolved in your heart." Right, and it goes into this. It says, "I am the storm child, born beneath the shadows of basalt cliffs and snow-clad evergreen. I rage with gin clarity through the mountains, empty of earth and her stains. In the slow time of youth, I flee an incomprehensible past and rush to an unknowable future, not perceiving the cascades that these rapids portend, until I awake on the flatlands to learn at last I have been falling all along.
Mm.
I am a wanderer, winding serpentine on the earth, savoring her secrets and sediments, and the strange new lands in life, and the mud and mysteries that abound between my banks. Time speeds as my waters slow, and in their roll the sacramental scars and sweet splendor of a distant youth. I am a memory, my story is written in water, and sung in the crystalline blue of the Ionian Sea, where I can flow at last and at last be lost." And anyway, I think that just came to mind, and I wrote that like back in 2002, so like 20 years ago now. But that kind of that necessity of the what the fall teaches us, right? And my sense is like I kind of had like a basically like a nervous breakdown, at the age of 22 or 23. Um, and the and I knew that it was significant even at that in that moment. Was like this was kind of what was going to set the course for my whole life. And this realization of like you live in that innocence of youth and all of the potentiality that kind of is encapsulated in that idealism, right? And there's a sense where you have to realize that no, you've actually, like, as a river comes from its headwaters, you're falling the whole time. And that idealism has to give way into the realism before you can finally reach your journey's end.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's within our fallenness that we learn that humility, and we learn that things are not quite as straightforward as they seem, but it's taking us inexorably to our destination, right? If you use that river metaphor for like life itself, is a river is a constantly flowing reality that it encompasses so much experience before it finally reaches its destination. And so I think, like, as we look at kind of, even within the nature of being and within the nature of love, there is kind of woven within love that catastrophic fall where love can realize itself again, outside of, the loss of innocence and the gaining of wisdom, and then the return to innocence, but through different eyes.
Yeah, well, see, the thing is that, like Soloviev says, the key to love is self-denial,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is a fall.
Mm-hmm.
That's what that is.
Well, there's an egotism of our youth that you can't escape. Like, you're just kind of in your world, and there's so much that you might have some awareness of, but you don't really know. Right. And so that the thing that kicks us out of the garden and moves us east of Eden is the very thing that ultimately is also pushing us and impelling us toward kind of our eschatological destination.
Mm.
You don't stay in Eden.
I mean, the older I don't know, from
Right.
my experiences,
Because
the older
in Eden, there's not yet an ego consciousness.
Right. And you have to have that.
You have to, right? That's the difference between that path of, seeking being, which is absorption back into the one, right? Versus the Christian path, which is not not absolute ego loss, but egoic redemption, where you have the lover and the beloved that are of one essence. So there's still a unity, but there's also a duality.
It's the kenotic egotism. Like, you have to have an ego awareness so that you can give
Right.
the ego away.
Well, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Precisely.
And I think, like you're saying, Jed, you think that you were always falling, right? If you're born into the world and then you age, okay? And as you age, you are required to deny yourself more and more and more. Mm-hmm. This is why my mother said to me once, getting old is not for sissies. Okay.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Because all of a sudden you have to say no, because you may not be physically able. You might not be mentally able. You might not be financially able, right? Or it's not appropriate, for grandma to go to the techno club and dance till 4 a.m. or whatever. Like, there's a lot of, and when you're young, you're like, you can do whatever you want. And it's true. You can.
Right.
Right.
Well, this is right, because this has to do, like, there's a connection to me, I think, between, like, the Harding's idea of the stages of development and what Tomberg's talking about here in terms of, like, the stages of like from mysticism to gnosis to magic to hermetic philosophy. So
Deification,
like
yeah.
you're before we started recording, when you did the little thing with your head, like you know how people, yeah, right. So and pointed out that that's the infinity symbol. Like, so mysticism alone, as he says in this chapter, isn't enough because it can just lead to like a desire for spiritual intoxication,
Yeah.
right? But I would like
That's
to
how
point,
CLSD trip. It's like, wow.
right. But for those but for those of our audience who might be of a more materialistic bent, I would still point out that like even if you think you've never had a mystical experience, if you've ever done that, listening to your favorite groove, you've had a mystical experience.
Anytime you've been
It's true.
Yeah, exactly.
anytime that you've been something has gripped you, um, there's yeah, I think that it's just being able to recognize it. I'm gonna go pick up something out of Steinbeck's East of Eden, so I'll be right back because it just
Okay.
reminds me of what you're
Sure,
saying.
go for it. In the meantime, I will read that section that Sherry was referencing because I found it
Oh, good.
about about the creation. Okay. Here it is not a matter of considering the doctrine of creation ex nihilo as the only explanation of the world that we find around us, within us, and above us, because the world is vast and great. There is room and there are other levels of existence for all modes of constructive activity, which taken all together explain the world of our experience such as it is. What is it a question of here? It is to affirm with as much clarity as possible the thesis that the doctrine of creation ex nihilo is the highest possible expression of magic, namely divine and cosmic magic. But if you ask me, dear unknown friend, if I believe that the creation of the world is only a magical act without something preceding and without something following it, I would reply to you, no, I do not believe this. A mystical act and a Gnostic act precede in eternity the act of creation as a magical act. This is followed by the activity of formation by the demiurge or the demiurgic hierarchies who undertake the work of craftsmanship, work which is essentially that of executive or hermetic philosophical intelligence. The
Hmm.
classical Kabbalah furnishes us with a marvelous example of the peace possible between apparently rival doctrines. In its doctrine of the Sephiroth, it teaches first the mystery of eternal mysticism, Ein Sof, the unlimited. Then it expounds the Gnostic doctrine of eternal emanations from the womb of the divine, which precede, in ordine cognoscendi, the act of creation. They arc the ideas of God within God, which precede the creation, the latter being a conscious act and not impulsive or instinctive. Then it speaks of pure creation or creation ex nihilo, the act of the magical projection of the ideas of the plan of creation, i.e., the Sephiroth. This creative magical act is followed, ordine cognoscendi always, by the activity of formation in which the beings of the spiritual hierarchies participate, including man. It is in this way, according to the Kabbalah, that world comes into being. That world of facts or deeds known to us through experience becomes what it is.
Yeah, nice. You know, when I read that, Nate, I was thinking about the conversation that we had with Joseph when I said to him, this is reminds me of psychology. Like, this is
Right,
how the mind works, right? But it's also how a child is born into the world.
right,
You know,
right.
and so
Oh
like
yeah,
I just thought,
he actually says that. He talks about, he compares like the birth of a child to the magical act.
right, and so it's, you know, like Jesus actually uses the term narrow gate, and it was a not too long ago that I thought, that's the cervix,
Hmm.
Yeah,
right? That's what that
I'm
is.
so sorry, guys. I got some calls from work that unfortunately I have to jump out. So
no problem.
it's been delightful. I wish I could hang out more, but I
Well,
got.
we'll have next time. It's
All
okay,
right,
Jed.
sounds good.
All
All right,
right. Talk to you
bye.
later.
Bye. Yeah, I don't remember what I was going to say about that, but it's just, I think, oh, I know, I was going to say, I just love how these patterns are just fractal. Like God is always talking about the same thing, right? And even within the example of a birth, like an actual birth, is a death and a resurrection, because the
Right.
child during birth has to descend, right, and then is born into this completely new world. Like, it's nothing like, right? It's like a new
Right.
heaven and a new earth.
Yes. Yeah. Let me actually see if I can find, since you brought up the birth thing, I think like right before the section I read is where he talks about the, uh, well, I can't find it, but in any case, yeah, he does actually make the analogy between birth and also just the creative acts,
Yeah.
like and like that's those really are, they are magical acts
And
in the
that
way he's
is
talking
also,
about.
like he says, magic is articulation, gnosis is hearing, listening attentively, and mysticism is contemplation, which is so you've got the contemplation, right, and then
Mhm.
and then it moves down into a listening mode, and then it is birthed out in an articulation,
Right. Yeah.
right?
He says that gnosis is like spiritual hearing, just as
Yeah.
mysticism is a
Spiritual
spiritual
touch.
sense of touch.
Yeah.
And then the magical act is a projection, and then the Hermetic philosophy is, does he say it's a synthesis? I think
Well, the
what he says.
mysticism, he talks, well, all those three, yes, is a synthesis of the micro and the macrocosm,
Right. Oh, it's a, he
which
says
is
it's a second synthesis, a synthesis after analysis is what he says. I found the,
synthesis after analysis.
yeah.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, which I thought was kind of interesting, because we talked a little bit about that last time with Michael,
Mhm.
um, that this, like he was talking about Henry Vaughan, Novalis, George MacDonald, and then what I had mentioned, he said that is sophiology, right? Is the synthesis of the micro and the macrocosm,
Mhm.
basically, which is, yeah, what
Well, yeah,
Hermeticism.
because like, well, I mean, that's like, so with this, all of these are, you're talking about the stages of the development of wisdom, right?
Yeah.
Which is ultimately like achieving a transformation of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just see if there's anything else that I had highlighted that I wanted to cover before we wrap up here. And then if you had any,
I think we got
we
all of the
did, there
notes.
was, yeah, I, what part of what we didn't talk about very much that I thought was interesting is where he talks about like what happens if you're missing any of these of these elements. Like what happens if what happens if you have mysticism, by itself. Oh, here we go. Uh, okay, here we go. Autonomous philosophical systems let's see. Autonomous philosophical systems set apart from the living tradition are parasitic structures, which seize the
Yeah.
thought, feeling, and finally the will of human beings. In fact, they play a role comparable to the psychopathological complexes of neurosis or other psychic maladies of obsession. Their physical analogy is cancer.
Yeah, I know. Okay, before you read more,
Yeah,
so is he linking that to tradition with a big T, like an institutional tradition?
it's a small t.
It's a small
Without
T.
a without the living body of tradition, it's small t.
Okay.
Um, so I think I mean, when he says tradition, I think what he means is, I think he means the tradition of traditionalism. So like the common mystical spiritual ground, which is shared by all religions.
Mhm,
This is
mhm.
what I think he means.
Okay.
Um, with respect to autonomous magic, magic without mysticism and without gnosis, it necessarily degenerates into sorcery, or at least into a pathological romantic aestheticism. There is no black magic, but rather sorcerers groping in the dark. They grope
Yeah.
in the dark because the light of gnosis and mysticism is lacking. Gnosis, without mystical experience, is sterility itself. It is just a religious ghost, without life or movement. It is the corpse of religion, animated intellectually by means of scraps fallen from the table of the past history of humanity. A universal Gnostic church. Good Lord. What can one say? What should be said when one has a knowledge, however limited, of the laws of spiritual life governing all tradition? Passing on to mysticism, which has not given birth to Gnosis, magic, and Hermetic philosophy, such a mysticism must sooner or later necessarily degenerate into spiritual enjoyment or intoxication. The mystic who wants only the experience of mystical states without understanding them, without drawing practical conclusions from them for life, and without wanting to be useful to others, who forgets everyone and everything in order to enjoy the mystical experience, can be compared to a spiritual drunkard.
Yes.
So tradition can only live, as with all other living organisms, when it is a complete organism of mysticism, gnosis, and effective magic, which manifests itself outwardly as Hermetic philosophy.
Yeah.
This means to say simply that tradition cannot live unless the whole human being lives through it, in it, and for it. For the whole human being is at one and the same time a mystic, a Gnostic, a magician, and a philosopher. He is religious, contemplative, artistic, and intelligent. Everyone believes in something, understands something, is capable of something, and thinks something. It is human nature which determines whether a tradition will live or die. And it is also human nature which is capable of giving birth to a complete tradition and keeping it living. Because the four senses, mystical, Gnostic, magical, and philosophical, exist, be it in potentiality or in actuality, in each human being.
Yeah, that's really important. That was a good.
It's very important. It also it corrected me under an impression that I had in my conversation with Michael. I suggested that I didn't think Tomberg's intended audience was necessarily everyone, and I think that flatly contradicts that impression that I had.
Right.
Because he is saying everyone is capable of these things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
that's a good note to end on.
Yeah, I think so. So that's a very good explanation of why everyone should listen to our series.
Yes, it's true.
On meditations on the tarot. Next up will be chapter or letter 3, which will be on the Empress. And we'll be talking about sacred magic and what Tomberg means by magic and lots of other.
This put a whole new spin on the idea that language is magic. Remember, Michael and I had that conversation?
Yes, I think absolutely. And I think you can see why you guys were right.
Well, he was right. Like when and it was interesting because he said it in a conversation just as an aside. And I texted him right away. I'm like, okay, wait a minute. That kind of blew me out of the water when you said that. I don't know why, but it just caught my attention and I want to talk about it.
Michael has amazing intuitions and insights.
So that, so he was really right about that. I hope he watches this and hears this, but because that's precisely what Tomberg says, that articulation is magic when something is born into the world, right? But
we'll get to learn more about magic next time.
Yeah,
so hold that thought, right? Because that's primarily what the subject of the next chapter is.
Right.
It's going to be about magic and what distinguishes sacred magic from personal magic, from sorcery, and all that thing.
Right, and Nate, it's actually just dawning on me why I have a difficult time with it, because, like I said at the beginning, I spent a long time contemplating and thinking, right, and learning, but I didn't have anyone to articulate my thoughts to, and so for me, language is a barrier, okay, because I'm in the process of articulation. I'm there. Right. I'm at that spot.
Right.
And yeah. So this is really, that's really good.
I think this is going to be a great series. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. For now, everyone.